All right, welcome back everyone to day three of 5G Blitz Week presented by Fierce Wireless. And what better way to get everyone excited than that great countdown video? It always wakes me up anyway. All right, my name is Alejandro Pinheiro. I'm the Senior Director for Conference Planning here at Fierce Wireless, and I'll be your host for this session and for the remainder of the week. Now, as always, a special thank you to our partner, Viavi Solutions, for supporting us and for lending their executives time for a great discussion ahead on how we can leverage 5G infrastructure to build for a 6G world. Now, we have a great hour ahead. I hope you're as excited as I am, and it's going to go a little bit like this. In just a few seconds, we're going to be hearing from Jonathan Edelstein. He's the president and CEO of WIA. And following his 15-minute keynote, we're going to go straight into our live panel hosted by Prakash Sangam from Tantra Analyst, another old friend here at Fierce. And he'll be joined by speakers from University of Notre Dame, Samsung Research, and Viavi Solutions. Now, I say this every session, so a lot of you have heard it, but always welcome your input, your thoughts, and your questions. You can send your hellos and your thoughts over the chat function just on the left-hand side of the screen. But if you want to send questions over to our panelists and our moderator today, you can do so using the Q&A tab, again, just on the left-hand side of the screen. All right, let's get this show started, as they say, and we're going to head right on over to our opening keynote by Jonathan Edelstein from WIA. Jonathan, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and happy 5G Blitz Week. I'm sure honored to join you all in introducing this amazing panel on building and leveraging infrastructure for a 6G world. At the Wireless Infrastructure Association, or WIA, we represent all the companies that make up the wireless infrastructure ecosystem in the whole US. At WIA, we're feeling like every week is 5G Blitz Week. So I couldn't be more excited to join you for the real Blitz Week. WIA's members are the infrastructure providers, wireless carriers, professional service firms, all those that own and operate wireless infrastructure around the world. And we're here to help the industry advance wireless networks. We serve as a united voice for wireless infrastructure before the federal government and state governments. And we try to bring businesses together. So, I'd really like to thank Fierce Wireless for inviting me here to such a great event. I mean, they've really put a spotlight on the future to illuminate how 5G is going to lay the roadmap for 6G. The private sector and government are working together on the road to 5G. We're just, I think, starting to actualize the full potential of 5G. Really nose down on trying to get it built out. So it kind of seems like, maybe we're ahead of the game now to focus on 6G. But before we start imagining the use cases for 6G, we really need to push 5G deployments forward successfully so that we can fulfill 5G's promise now. Universal availability of 5G is crucial to speed the evolution. And that's why infrastructure deployment is so essential. Of course, infrastructure is the watchword these days. We're happy to see $65 billion coming out of Congress. Not just the government, but industry is nonstop innovating. And competition is driving wireless ahead and changing the way it gets built. So I'm really looking forward to watching the panel ahead, which features some of the world's leading experts to point the way. Professor Manisha Ghosh, Dan Warren, Dr. Ian Wong, and Prakash Sangam are going to join us to help us understand where we're at and where we're going. We certainly have a long way to go before the full potential of 5G is realized. We have yet to see how it will drive revenue to accelerate investment. That's always been a big concern of mine. We've talked about these whiz-bang applications we've expected, but they have yet to emerge. So we're looking for the business cases that's going to really drive investment forward. But you do see 5G already changing business models that are setting the stage for 6G. 5G opened up new ways to imagine mobile networks and integrate them into enterprise. New 5G campus networks are laying the groundwork, I think, for enterprise networking and new business models for customers. 6G will likely put the emerging trends toward more engaged enterprise customers for wireless infrastructure providers on steroids. Not the kind that gets you banned from the Olympics, but the kind that helps you actually win. Competition and consumer demand, meanwhile, are driving more need for bandwidth, and that's requiring deployment. And WI members are leading the way. Wireless produces a new G about every 10 years. You remember 4G was developed around 2009, 2010. We then expected 5G to be developed by about 2020, and sure enough, right on track it was. And now again, on track, the International Telecommunications Union started the IMT's vision for 2030 and beyond. That'll pave the way for 6G right around 2030. And we want to make sure the US is the 6G leader. Recent developments abroad that we're all watching with amazement and horror really underscore how important it is that the US lead the way. So I'm glad that the industry in the US, including many of WI's members, announced the Next G Alliance in October 2020, because you really need an early start to remain competitive. And the growing complexity requires more research and testing to make 6G happen. And we've been the industry leader at WI in preparing the US for this network evolution. We're working very closely with the industry partners and government stakeholders to make sure that the US leads in the race to 6G, just as we're doing in 5G. So I'm really happy that our new CTO, Dr. Ricken Thacker, was appointed by FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel to the FCC's Technological Advisory Council, the TAC. He shares that honor with Monisha Ghosh, who you'll hear from on the next panel. Now, TAC designated one of its 4 working groups about 6G that Dr. Thacker is assigned to. And here, WI is going to provide its recommendations to the FCC on ways to develop informed technology policies to advance 6G innovation, particularly when it comes to infrastructure needs. And as an industry association, we certainly know that the multi-stakeholder process works best for developing policies to ensure that the US does lead. We're working to amplify broad inputs from our industry so that we're heard on policymaking circles around the world in the evolution of 6G. I think at a high level, regulators need to avoid prescriptive regulations that will slow down or hamper industry advancements. We're at this super early stage, and we need continued light touch regulation to give the industry the space to focus on innovation. And of course, we need more spectrum at higher and higher frequencies for 6G. So far, I've been encouraged by lawmakers' willingness to prioritize US leadership on not only 5G, but thinking about 6G. They've already passed in the Senate the Next Generation Telecommunications Act. WA strongly supported that bill and have signed into law to create a council to advise Congress on 6G advancement. And we're making sure industry inputs are heard in Congress and at every level of government, at the FCC as well, to make sure the US has a strong start. But I think the best start we can give ourselves on this next race is to fully meet the goals we've set for 5G. Fully realizing the potential of 5G will really set us up for success in the race to 6G. And that's because 5G is the most upgradable generation of wireless. But to unlock this potential, the wireless ecosystem has to deliver on the promise of 5G. To achieve this, our industry, of course, is deploying denser cell sites, both at the macro tower and the small cell level. We're carrying signals at low band, mid band, and the highest bands ever at millimeter wave frequencies. And the work's made a lot of progress. We're witnessing the growth in the number of cell sites that were built since 5G trials started about 2017, 2018. Since then, according to CTI's annual survey, over 417,000 cell sites were built and operational in the US by the end of 2020, which is a 35% increase since 2016. It's been a good time for the infrastructure industry. In just the 2 years since we implemented historic federal siting reforms that WIA championed, both at the FCC and at the states, more cell sites were built than in the previous 7 years combined. In 2 years, we've done more than in 7 years. And that means prescription number 1 is to make sure the FCC, once it has a full majority, doesn't undo these reforms that were clearly so successful. Deploying 5G allows us to provide power and backhaul connectivity through fiber at our cell sites. It's crucial to have in place for 6G. By achieving this kind of densification, 5G will pave the way, because 6G is going to require even denser networks than we've seen. We saw 4G densify toward the end stages that prepared us for 5G, and it's going to be even more densified for 6G. Now, the same thing is happening with spectrum. We saw higher and higher spectrum bands being used for 5G and the multi, type of spectrum deployments we're seeing. And now we need new spectrum, up to terahertz frequencies for 6G applications. And of course, related network equipment such as radios and antennas need to be upgraded to support new frequency bands for 6G. Researchers from universities and enterprise are thinking through right now the future use cases of 6G and thinking about the related network architecture. But we have a huge task at hand right now in deploying 5G quickly and correctly to make sure that we can fully realize 5G use cases. And those use cases, as I said, need to drive revenues to speed deployment to the degree that we've talked about, but not seen so far in terms of use cases. And we're beginning to see progress, but we need to achieve use cases like driverless cars and connecting millions of IoT devices and billions of IoT devices eventually, which we'll see in 6G. And virtual reality and augmented reality applications are still in their early phases, but we expect 6G to really drive them forward. And we should look to achieve, holographic conferences that will have a transformative impact on how we conduct business in our daily lives. Of course, it shouldn't replace great conferences like ConnectX that WI is putting on in May, coming up soon here in Denver. But I think these exciting technologies really should be possible in 6G. But we need to set the stage in 5G. So we need to invest in 5G, but prepare for that. But I think keeping the network equipment and technology updated is what's happening. It's a principle I like to call keep your stuff updated. That's a nice way to put it. And we're doing that, and we're also doing that with spectrum. We're exercising key practice to make ready for future generations. We're spectrum refarming. As you know, spectrum was not particularly efficiently used in 2G, so we were able to discontinue that and repurpose spectrum for 4G, which is much more efficient. And of course, 5G is more efficient than 3G, and that's being repurposed to make sure that there's room for 5G. So taking old radios offline provides a huge benefit to consumers done right by allowing the industry to reuse those bands for 5G and eventually 6G. Another way is diversing, making more diverse types of wireless infrastructure deployments. Having, we're seeing towers getting upgraded, many more small cells getting deployed, all connected by deeper and deeper fiber into the networks. And that's really setting the stage for 6G. Future generations of networks are going to be infrastructure agnostic. The technology is going to sit on all kinds of infrastructure. I think as you see increasing densification, you see more and more creative ways to co-locate on different infrastructure assets. To fully realize the capabilities of 5G to prepare for 6G, we need to build even smarter networks. AI-driven infrastructure with automated traffic management and spectrum allocation will lay the groundwork for the evolution of 6G. Networks of the future will be cognitive in nature. 6G should be able to implement cognitive capabilities into our cellular infrastructure more than we're even seeing today. We'll see artificial intelligence techniques, including machine learning and machine reasoning, as well as adaptive data and knowledge management. Through observations, cognitive networks can, for example, autonomously find patterns in resource usage, such as spectrum allocation, and take actions to optimize the usage toward the objectives that are needed to get more capacity out, to get lower latency. More autonomy in the network also means that humans are interacting with it by setting requirements and goals that reflect the operator's business objectives and customer needs. Carriers upgrading and working towards smarter networks will prepare for artificial intelligence and machine learning to take a more central role in managing networks, and that'll be a key element of 6G. AI is and will increasingly be a crucial part of controlling networks, especially, I think, as more devices and autonomous vehicles and phones and sensors in smart cities become integrated with less human intervention. One way providers are working towards smarter networks now is prepare future networks by expanding more edge computing. This will reduce latency, which is going to be even greatly reduced by 6G. It'll bring computing power to the end user in the short term, but ultimately it'll support better machine learning. More edge computing is essential to support successful 6G, since 6G is going to require more computing power. And as I said, a lot lower latency. So smarter networks with more edge computing will support this increased need for computing power. So all the increases we're seeing in edge computing now, and I think it's just getting going, is preparing us for this evolution. Data centers are already changing to keep up with 5G virtualization and programmable networks. They're tackling supporting public and private networks. 6G will create even more data, a huge wave of more data that will need huge increases in capacity. We're beginning to see this, of course, with 5G, but the network has to evolve to coordinate edge and core platforms. data centers will grow to manage vastly increased capacity demands for network owners and service providers. I'd like to highlight maybe just 2 of the 6 goals set by the NextG Alliance in their roadmap to 6G. These 2 will certainly help us define 6G network architecture. First, distributed cloud and communication systems, and second, sustainability. Our distributed architecture in the 4G and 5G networks are already providing innovative solutions such as CRAN and ORAN. Distributed cloud will be built on virtualization technologies and will increase flexibility, performance, and resiliency. This will truly enhance some of the applications such as interactive gaming and low latency applications enabled by 6G. And as for sustainability, it's, the consumption of energy. I think ultimately wireless can make enormous progress for the world. Implementation of these recommendations across radios and hardware will have an enormous impact on sustainability. We need to make sure as we advance our technology, our networks achieve ITU's goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2040. And while 5G uses a lot of power, it saves far more than it uses. In fact, the World Economic Forum estimates 5G and related digital technology will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 15%. And that's huge because it's 1/3 of the way toward the goal of reducing emissions by 50% by 2030. I think 6G will do even more to save the world from greenhouse gases. So it's really exciting. I'm thrilled to see the continued deployment. 5G going ahead so fast and what this will mean for the future of networks. 4G cleared the way for 5G. And when it comes to 6G, the quality of the infrastructure we're planning now will lead to a successful evolution to 6G. Use cases and applications of this and the next generation will support, I think, our future lives in ways that are really unrecognizable today, in ways that we can't possibly predict, but they're going to be really exciting. And we're going to be around to see them because it's right around the corner here in less than 10 years in 2030. But we still have a long way to go before this is all a reality. So I really look forward to watching this next panel discuss the ways we can build and leverage 5G infrastructure for a 6G transition. So thanks so much for joining, and thanks to Fierce Wireless for having me here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for getting us started this morning on such a great note. And now we're going to head over right to our live panel, hosted and moderated by Prakash Sangam from Tantra Analyst, and he's joined by panelists from the University of Notre Dame, Samsung Research, and Viavi Solutions. So Prakash and team, all yours.
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you, Jonathan, for a good introduction to our panel. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. Thanks for joining in. Let's do some destination check. If you're looking for the most awesome session of the day at 5G Blitz Week, you're at the right place. That's because we are going to discuss one of the latest and the most coolest technologies in the cellular space today, and that's 6G, as Jonathan mentioned. We'll specifically look at what is 6G and how to transition to it from where we are today, which is the first step of 5G. Let me get started with some quick introductions. As Alejandro said, I am Prakash Sangam. I'll be moderating this session. In terms of background, I am the founder and principal of Tantra Analyst. We are a boutique industry analyst firm covering 5G, AI, IoT, and other tech areas. Personally, I have more than 20 years of experience working for AT&T, Ericsson, and Qualcomm, and I'm also a 3GPP member. I write for Forbes, Fierce Wireless, RCR Wireless News as well, and I host a podcast called Tantra's Mantra. Enough about me. Now let's introduce our esteemed panel, which, as I mentioned, is very diverse, representing different parts of the ecosystem. I would like each of our panelists to give a brief introduction about themselves, about their company, and also briefly answer this question. What is the biggest challenge for 5G expansion? Right? So, introduction about yourself and answering the question, what is the biggest challenge for 5G expansion that you see from your company or domain perspective? Let's start with Ian, followed by Monisha and Dan.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Prakash. My name is Ian Wong. I'm Director of RF and Wireless Architecture at the CTO office of Viavi Solutions. So I look a lot into technology strategy, our standards and architectures across various RF and wireless technologies. So Viavi is a leader in the test and measurement industry, focusing on 5G networks, fiber and wireless and RF. We have lab to field to assurance products that span across the whole network lifecycle. So and that's really the core focus of a lot of my work and research. And prior to Viavi, I was with National Instruments NI for about 11 and a half years. So I joined Viavi fairly recently, about 14, 15 months ago. To kind of answer your question there, Prakash, I think from my perspective, the biggest challenge for 5G is quite simply cost and complexity. It's probably not surprising. I mean, ultimately, 5G starting with complexity is without a doubt, the most complex G since we started. It's meant to cover a lot of use cases. It's got a distributed nature. It's covering a lot of spectrum bands. And so it's also moving very quickly towards advanced technologies like virtualization and openness and disaggregation. So these are all, I would say, challenges to make sure that we test them well. And once we deploy them, test them again, and once it's deployed, continue to test it, right? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is really to make sure that the network is robust and can serve the industry well. And cost is kind of, I would say, spectrum cost, capital, and OpEx are all challenges, and we all understand kind of the challenges with that, in this industry. So
Right. Thank you, Anne. Manisha?
Thanks, Prakash. Glad to be on this panel. My name is Monisha Ghosh. I joined the University of Notre Dame as a professor in the electrical engineering department just this past January. I'm also the policy outreach director for Spectrum X. Spectrum X is a center, multi-university center funded by the National Science Foundation to research long-term issues surrounding spectrum, how we can better manage it, how we can better share it, not only between active commercial users, but also between passive users of spectrum. Prior to coming to the University of Notre Dame, I was a research faculty at the University of Chicago, and concurrently, I was also the CTO of the FCC. And prior to that, I was at NSF as a program manager, and then most of my career actually at this point has been in industry. So I bring a mix of industry, government, and academia into looking at this question that is in front of us. My research interests, and also I think the area which addresses Prakash's question about what I think are one of the biggest challenges in 5G is the availability of spectrum. As we look forward to 5G and even forward into 6G, the options seem to be quite limited in terms of either you go to higher and higher spectrum where there's a lot of bandwidth, but there are lots of cost and complexity issues that one has to face, or we look at the mid-band where the propagation is much better, but it's already all allocated. So we really have to focus a lot better on how we can make spectrum available in a timely fashion. 5G has been rolling out for more than 2 years now, and we're still having auctions. The latest one is going to be in the 2.5 gigahertz. I think we need to position ourselves to be in a better place for 6G so that by the time the standards and the technology is ready, the spectrum is available to deploy as well.
Absolutely. We'll touch upon spectrum as well as some of the cost aspects in the discussion. Yeah. Thanks, Manisha. Dan?
Thanks, Prakash. My name's Dan Warren. I'm the Director of Advanced Network Research at Samsung Research in the UK. Prior to that, I've held roles at GSMA for 7 years. I worked at Vodafone for 3 years, and before that for Nortel. Good old Nortel. what I do now is I look at the development beyond 5G and towards 6G, and it's really good to hear from Jonathan that the US is going to lead that development, because based in Europe, we also think that Europe is going to lead that development too. So we'll all be leading together, which is always good. But when it comes to the opening question around what do we need to do to kind of continue the expansion of 5G from where we are now, I think the biggest challenge that we have is actually the business case. Ian talked about the cost, but I think it's the business case as a whole, particularly as you move beyond B2C type business case models. So 5G was predicated on the idea that we were going to address all the requirements that come in from enterprise sectors, and that's a pretty broad brush that we've tried to sweep there as an industry. So taking into account the requirements that come from health, from industry, from automotive V2X, from IoT in general. Gathering all of that together and trying to solve it in 1G is quite a challenge, and then also believing that we have the adaptability in the business case from day one to address all of those markets, when the initial rollout was always going to be about B2C. It was always going to be about consumers, because that's what most networks need to actually justify the business case in the first place. So in order to expand 5G, particularly beyond where 4G has got to, we have to start to understand what it is that the other industry sectors want, and actually deliver against it in terms of the SLAs that we've promised from the outset. And in many cases, the SLAs which are still not met are not so much technology challenges as challenges around building 100% coverage, or building in 5 nines or 6 nines reliability, which the technology is understood, but it requires quite a lot of investment on the operator side to actually go and put the infrastructure in place to enable, for example, an agricultural use case which requires coverage of fields which perhaps people only visit once or twice a year. So I think that the biggest challenge is not necessarily technology for expanding. It's actually understanding the business case from where we are now. And then when we come to progress that towards 6G, we'll have a really good set of infrastructure in place to start to build on top of, and deliver even more ambitious SLAs, having achieved some of the things which we aim to set out at the beginning of 5G.
Very nice. So indeed, a lot of challenges, as you know, and each one of you have pointed out a different challenge as such. So let me get started with some very basic question. Right, 5G came with lots and lots of promises. How are we delivering on it? Do you think 5G is mainstream right now, or is it in a long way to go before we even think about the next G? Let's start with Dan this time.
Um, and I guess I kind of hark back to my previous answer. It's mainstream if you're a consumer, and we're seeing 5G appearing on even the kind of mid-range and low-range handsets now, which come from most handset providers. There's a really large number of networks out there in certainly most developed markets, and increasingly in developing markets as well. The price point for 5G is not drastically more than it is for 4G. I'm sitting here looking around my desk. I work for Samsung, so I've got a lot of handsets knocking around, but I reckon I have 6 5G handsets on my desk at the moment. So, in terms of becoming mainstream in the pockets of people like us, then yes, 5G is out there and it's available, but it's not mainstream in the sense that if you go back and look at things like the NGMN white paper that set out the vision of 5G in 2015, that had some very ambitious goals in terms of expanding beyond just what consumers want, and taking 5G out into other industries. I don't think we're anywhere near addressing that yet, and I think that remains a thing which stops us from sort of ticking the really big box of saying 5G is mainstream in the places we'd like it to be. It's mainstream in the same way that perhaps 4G was 4 years after launch, but it hasn't achieved the ambition that 5G set out to achieve yet.
Monisha, thanks, Dan.
Actually, just taking off from Dan's point, as we're looking at 5G and 6G, it's also instructive to look back at 4G and 5G. So 4G, I guess everybody would agree, is mature today. It's as mature as it's going to get, because 5G is waiting in the wings to take it over. And if you look at the metrics that 4G had set out to achieve, and I'll just pick 2 of them, peak data rate of 1 gigabits per second, and a latency of 10 milliseconds. Neither of those were met. as far as I know. Maybe in one-off cases where you had everything, the stars aligned just right, maybe you hit that metric. But for most cases, those metrics were not met. 5G has set for those two metrics numbers of 20 gigabits per second peak data rate and a 1 milliseconds latency. I would be thrilled if those metrics were met, but most likely they will not too. So we have this kind of sliding goalposts where we set goalposts for 1G, they don't get met by that G, and the next G take over. So 5G has already surpassed the 1 gigabits per second peak data rate set by 4G. So we're clearly meeting that. It still hasn't met the latency rate. And that is, I think, one of the challenges, which I think that Dan pointed out, is that so much of the focus has been on just the EMBB part of 5G. The other ones that will really open up new use cases, the URLLC, the IoT, those have received less attention. And if we truly want to move 5G beyond just an enhanced data rate version of 4G, I think we need to start paying more attention to those parts of the specification, which again, as a researcher, those were the ones that were most exciting. Those were the ones that could really open up new areas. And bringing it back to the theme of infrastructure, I think the infrastructure, there's lots of new cell stations going up, lots of fiber being laid, but we also need to pay attention to things like edge computing, because that infrastructure is absolutely essential if you really want to go to the URLLC promise. So yeah, I would be thrilled if 5G promises were kept, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were not, because we already have 6G waiting to take it over.
Yeah, thanks, Manisha. Ian, your turn.
Yeah, I mean, I am even more pessimistic than Manisha and Dan. I don't think even for EMBB, I mean, we're talking about mainstream, right? What does mainstream mean, right? Mainstream means it's the dominant technology. It's the de facto technology. I mean, I would say 4G is mainstream for EMBB. 5G is on the cusp. We'll get to I mean, again, like it's also regional, right? Of course, North America, Europe, Eastern Asia has a lot more uptake of 5G for EMBB, but think about the rest of the world, right? I would say, maybe in 5 years, 5G will be mainstream for EMBB, right? And then if you look at I've been working for a long time, and as they always say, you should always try to under promise and over deliver. And I think definitely our industry is terrible at that, right? I think Manisha and Dan has already beat that to death. But I mean, I think we're again not being too pessimistic. Right? I think ultimately our role as an industry is there's kind of this build it and they will come kind of mentality, right? And I think we need to set aggressive targets, because if you don't aim for the stars, you might aim for the moon and you land somewhere in the middle, right? So I think there is that here's where we want to go. Definitely for 6G as well. But I just like how 3G was for data promises and 4G fulfilled it, I see 6G as really promising, or I guess fulfilling, definitely, I would say, hopefully most of the 5G promises. So yeah, at least that's my
Yeah, so I think the general consensus here is basically what is set out for this G will be achieved by the next G. So, right. So considering that, numerically 6G comes after 5G, but there is this big release in between called 5G Advanced that nobody talks about, right? I mean, it's always cool to talk about the next G. So then is 5G Advanced going to satisfy what the promise of 5G was? 5G Advanced, as stated by 3GPP, it'll have at least two releases. It's starting from 18 and 19, maybe three, depending on how it goes. So how do you think 5G Advanced being a fulfiller of the promise of 5G? Manisha, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, so I will plead in ignorance to the details of 5G Advanced. I know that we're working on a number of things. But in my mind, I think that is exactly the kind of progression we want. We want to have continuous progress being made. And that's always been the case. Even with 4G, you started off with one version with something that was clearly different. And then you iterated on it as time went on. Things got added on. What I would like to avoid not happening is again, sort of building on what was said before about the hype, and you have carriers start labeling 5G advanced as 6GE or something like that. Let's not jump the bandwagon. Let's really understand what 5G is, because the reason 5G advanced needs to come out is because there were so many ideas that were on the plate when 5G was being designed that have not reached maturation. And massive MIMO, we have that, but there's always room to grow into number of antennas. The aerial platforms, that is something that needs to mature. I already talked about URLLC, the private enterprise networks that Jonathan referred to in his keynote. I think if I were to pick two things that clearly set 5G apart from 4G. It would be new spectrum, which was millimeter wave, and new applications like private 5G network. Because if you look into the physical layer, it didn't really change much. The actual guts of 5G stayed more or less the same. And of course, the Open RAN concept, right? There's a lot of promise in Open RAN, but it's still, a lot of it is promise. We will see it start rolling out in 5G, but it has to meet the cost performance metrics that a non-Open RAN system can achieve. And I hope that by the time 6G comes around, some of those concepts will mature. So 5G advanced to me is the space where you're maturing a lot of ideas, pushing them out, and maybe some of those will really get legs in 6G. Maybe some of those won't, but that's a natural progression, and it's a good thing.
Dan, after that, Ian.
Yeah, so 5G advanced, I think, is addressing a lot of the things that Manisha was just talking about. So, yeah, looking at where we've got to in release 15 and release 16 with 5G specifications in 3GPP, there's enough out there to build a network, but there's not enough necessarily. There's not enough functionality to do all the things which, again, we've promised to other industry sectors, or that we've promised for 5G to support as baseline underlying technologies which we need to build the service offerings for either an advanced consumer offering or an advanced enterprise offering on top of. So yeah, I think that if you look at the roadmap in release 17 and release 18 in 3GPP, there's a lot of features there which, if we were talking about a 5G network that was going to deliver everything, you'd hope would be in there from day one. Essentially, release 17, release 18 is finishing the job. It's putting in place the pieces of functionality which need to be there for us to expand 5G out into some of those enterprise markets. And then beyond that, we start to see the groundwork being laid for the beginnings of 6G standardization, which will come along over the next 5 to 10 years. I wanted to come back briefly to something which Ian said about build it and they will come, which is certainly the way that networks were built at the very beginning of mobile technology. And every time we added something on top, every layer that was added on top, so first delivering just a network tool, then delivering a network which was digital and secure, then delivering something which supported data, then delivering something which supported genuine broadband data. We shifted there from a kind of a pioneer spirit of build it and they will come towards something of build it because we know they're going to come. And that's a very different model. When you know that the market is there already, it makes you a lot more cautious. And the other thing which has happened is a growing maturity in the market, which is reflected by operators increasingly having a profit margin and shareholders and people that they have to satisfy that they're not a risk. They're not on dangerous ground when it comes to doing something truly new and innovative. And unfortunately, what we need with 5G, as we go out to address some of the bigger picture business opportunities which are outside of consumer, is we need to go back to that pioneer spirit. We need to go back to an element of build it and they will come. The problem is that when we go out and we look at other industries, like, for example, healthcare, it's not one big opportunity. We view it as one opportunity, but in actuality, the opportunities arrive at the doors of operators bottom up. So it's not 2 billion healthcare devices, it's connecting a hospital or connecting a doctor's surgery or connecting a medical outpost. And all of those have different requirements. So the thing which we need to address in 5G Advanced is inherent flexibility within the way that a practical proposition is designed and built to put into a network in the first place. And that's where softwareization and virtualization has taken us in terms of having flexibility around network topology, functionality, adaptation at network edge. And that can enable us then to go on and address some of these bigger opportunities as we move forward into 5G Advanced.
Ian, your view of 5G Advanced?
Really hard to follow those two answers, but I would say I would add a couple of things in 5G Advanced that I think that I'm personally excited about. Right, I think first of all is we talked a lot about millimeter wave in the run up to 5G. I mean, I was in that space. I was part of that research thrust towards both millimeter wave and massive MIMO. I think clearly we're not there yet in terms of, again, even millimeter wave being close to being mainstream, right? I think there's a lot of challenges left, and to be honest, like we kind of knew that going in because it's brand new spectrum, it's new ways of using it. So 5G Advanced with kind of enhancements to IAB, integrated access backhaul, making the relays a lot smarter, making the relays be able to move. That will inherently increase the coverage without, again, incurring the costs of too much fiber, right? And although laying out fiber is good for business for Viavi, but I think for millimeter wave to truly be, again, mainstream, I think things like IAB needs to continue to mature and beam management and things like that. The number two, I would say, not necessarily in order, but area of, I guess, study in 5G Advanced that really paves the way for 6G is AI and ML, right? I think if you think about it, in the run up to 5G, it's still AI and ML really came to its peak hype, right? And also kind of promise towards I would say the past couple of years, or not, definitely for the network, right? I think now 3GPP is serious about looking at how to utilize AI and ML technologies to improve the network, potentially improve the air interface, and I think this is the laying out the groundwork for really the 6G infrastructure.
Yeah, so let me turn back around and ask you the same question. So how do you define, if you have to explain to somebody who knows that 5G had all this hype, and probably not many people understand what was 5G Advanced, and now they see that everybody's talking about 6G, how do you explain 6G? How do you define 6G at a very high level? Ian?
Yeah, 6G is 5 plus 1G right now. No, I think, I would say I'm more of the pragmatist, right? I think we have to be cautious, right? I think at the end of the day, we just talked about 5G not even being mainstream yet, right? I think there is, of course, room for the visionaries and laying out the groundwork for what's going to come next, right? I think there are some skeptics out there that are saying, why does it need to be every 10 years? That seems to be artificial, right? Is that just driven by really the way we've always done things the past 3 generations, right? So I think there are some people who say, why don't we go for 6G quicker, or why don't we go for 6G later? I would say, to me, what's been apparent is like the analogy here is when you buy a house, right, and then maybe your family starts growing, and then you realize that you start adding extensions, you're putting more improvements. Eventually, you run out of room, and you say, what, it's going to be more cost effective for me to move to a maybe a bigger house, and that's start fresh, and then you can do things that you've always wanted to do in your new house, right? I see it that way for 6G, right? At the end of the day, 5G will potentially eventually run out of room. it will realize that it wasn't designed for AI/ML from the start. And that's where I see we will need to make that switch. And I'd rather use that and really the motivation of what our goals are for evolving the network rather than saying we need to do it in 2030. And because that's always how we've done it. So at least that's my opinion.
Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I maybe will go one step further than Ian. We're out skepticizing each other at the moment. I'm not entirely convinced that we need an explicit 6G at all, other than for marketing purposes. But then I wasn't entirely convinced we needed an explicit 5G either. I can see Manisha is going to probably say we need it for more spectrum, but the point being that we've got to a point now with networks where so much of the network can be upgraded through software, and the expectation is that we can have highly diversified networks delivering different topologies, different pieces of functionality, different capabilities, different service offerings. You want to have that flexibility maintained, and having put it in place, you need to exploit it. So you could have different parts of the network evolving at different rates, and particularly if we get network slicing right, and I think there's still some way to go for that, if you can basically partition bits of the network off and you can almost experiment with them on their own, and if it works, great, and then you can maybe bring it into mainstream or bring it into other parts of the network. If it doesn't, turn it off and forget about it. Then suddenly the whole kind of generational process of defining what a network does becomes broken, because you're doing things in a much more kind of enterprise IT model of persistent upgrade, persistent release, consistently changing software and modifying and improving, to the extent that you don't really have a point which is a new big bang release of something special or something spectacular. You just have new bits which you add onto the network. It's Ian's extensions. You've bought yourself a plot with your house which has got as much space left and right and backwards and forwards as you want to just keep building. I'd find it very yeah. I mean, I'd find it very easy to call myself director of 6G research rather than director of advanced network research, and I like the advanced network part of my job title because partly it's not pinned to a point in time, so it's continuous, and it means that once we get to 6G, I'm not out of a job. But equally, it's reflective of how network research has actually always been done. We work on new things that improve networks, either starting from the point where we find ourselves now, or as something which is spectacularly new and we drop it into a network as a new piece of functionality some point down the line. Where a G comes in, it's a good place to set goals, but it's really a pin drop when it comes to research. It's all the things that you've been doing up to this point coalesced within a 3GPP standard or a point within the community. So yeah, well, how do I define what 6G is? I don't. I just talk about network research.
Okay, Monisha.
When I was at the National Science Foundation, we would often have companies or people from other countries come in and ask us, what is NSF funding for 6G research? And my response always would be is that we've been funding 6G research all along, because as Dan said, 6G is a brand name. It's a label you stick on something when you think it's ready to have a label stuck on it. The fundamental ideas behind what is going to be the next generation of networks is ongoing, and it should be ongoing. And going back to the analogy of the house and the plot of land, if there is one thing that I would say limits how much you can keep expanding the house, is the plot of land you have, and the analogy for that is spectrum. So I think one of the key things we need to realize today is that it's early days for 5G, but really the biggest gains that are coming from 5G is because it has more spectrum. So, you give 100 megahertz of spectrum to 5G and you compare it against 20 gigahertz of spectrum for 4G, of course it's going to be better, right? The question that nobody asks, and I've asked this many times and I haven't gotten a good answer, is if that 100 megahertz of spectrum had a 4G system deployed on it instead of 5G, would it be that much worse? So we really have to start asking ourselves as to what we are doing with constantly going from 1G to the other, and I know it's anathema to talk about Wi-Fi in the cellular domain, but I think there are lessons to be learned with how to make systems backward compatible. So you don't phase out a G, you don't throw away your own devices, you don't rip out infrastructure, but you constantly build on it. And that is why I much prefer, labels like next G, or it's a constant evolution. As new spectrum comes along, you just get more bandwidth. Maybe you can employ AI and other tools better. 6G should, I think, be more about laying a framework that you can build in forever, so that 6G is the last G, that you don't have to keep doing this discrete evolutions over time.
Very well. So, I mean, if you look at 5G Advanced, which I think will be ultimately commercialized in 6G, is have this very flexible dynamic air interface, right? So you don't have to come up with new interface with every G.
Right.
You basically have AI models on both network and device, so they can work together and come up with whatever new or better than based on whatever the application or the use case they're working on, right? So, yeah, so I think you touched upon another important subject, spectrum, right? A lot of times if you look back, I mean, G's were kind of posed as a reason to get more spectrum from the regulators, from the governments and such, and then it used to be an excuse, but now it is very apparent to everybody in the ecosystem that spectrum is the key thing, no matter what G you want to put on it. So how do you see the spectrum evolving? As we all mentioned, and specifically you, that we don't have enough spectrum even for 5G. There is some that is there in mid band, more a little bit more coming, and everything else is in extremely high bands, which has a lot of use cases, but limited on a for public networks, so providing ubiquitous coverage and so on. So, what other bands that you are looking at that will be made available in 5G Advanced or 6G? How they are placed compared to where we are today. Any views on that? Let's start with Manisha.
Yeah, so I'm chairing the Advanced Spectrum Sharing Work Group as part of the TAC, where we are looking at all of these questions. We talk about sub-6, which has become sub-7 now, because now we have the Wi-Fi band there, and then we talk about millimeter wave. There is a swathe of spectrum between, say 7 gigahertz and 24 gigahertz. Most of it is allocated. But I think now is the time to start looking at what spectrum can be shared, because clearly in the mid band, you're not going to be necessarily continue to follow the model of we will be able to clear out all incumbents and we're going to auction it. So right now in the US, we are looking at the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz spectrum. There's a lot of DoD installations there, which will continue to be there. So coming up with innovative ways of sharing spectrum between incumbents is very important. And we have to sort of accelerate that space of finding spectrum, identifying what the incumbents are, how we can share spectrum with them, and then continue to do that across the entire range. 6 gigahertz in the US, the decision was to keep that whole band, 1.2 gigahertz of spectrum, unlicensed. That does not mean that it cannot be used by cellular. I fully expect and hope that it will be shared on, using 5G and RU, like LAA was shared with Wi-Fi in 5 gigahertz. So trying to realize that as a consumer, I want to be connected wirelessly. I don't really care whether it's a 6G or a Wi-Fi 6E or a Wi-Fi 7. So making all of the wireless modalities work seamlessly across the spectrum we have. And to be clear, I personally, and this is my opinion, I don't think we have a shortage of spectrum. We are not managing the spectrum we have very well. And that needs to be improved when we look ahead in the future as to where we get to spectrum. And just the final thought is that as we think about sharing spectrum, more and more issues like FAA and 5G, weather radar and 5G will emerge, because as you're sharing spectrum, you're bumping up against users, not only in your band, but in adjacent bands. And to be aware of what is around you when you're trying to deploy systems, there is an effort within the FCC to look at receiver standards. So there's a lot of, I think, forward-thinking, longer-thinking approaches that hopefully will go to make sure that when systems are ready, the spectrum is ready too. And to go back to Dan's point, that is the only part, I think, of the entire stack you cannot softwareize. Unfortunately, you have to have the spectrum. After that, hardware, software, that evolution will continue.
Well, thanks. Ian, you mentioned about working on millimeter wave, so there is now talk about terahertz, sub-terahertz spectrum and so on. Any views on spectrum for 5G bands
Yeah,
and 6G?
I would say, I mean, more, let's say for the 6G, but not necessarily for 5G advances. I mean, I
Mm.
personally am pretty excited at the, people have called it mid-high band, basically between 7 to 24 gigahertz, right? Right now, it's being used by satellite. Again, what we've learned in 5G is millimeter wave got all the hype. At the end of the day, I would say the mid-band spectrum is where the money is going to be made, right? So that's the coverage, that's the capacity it's a great trade-off. I would say 7 to 24 is kind of similar. It's of course a bit more challenging, but still not as challenging as you go up to 28 and beyond, right? So I think 7 to 24, I'm pretty excited about. Um, Cognitive spectrum, I think Dan has mentioned this, Manisha, as well. We need to be smarter, right? Again, going back to the land analogy, right? Like, it's right now we allocate these parcels of land and only one person can use it, and then nobody else can come in, and otherwise they'll be shot, right? So, like Texas, so which is I'm from. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we have to be more intelligent about using this scarce resource that we have, right? And I think cognitive spectrum. And terahertz, I would say it's one of those, again, like, millimeter wave. There's a lot of hype. Obviously, there is some reality to some of it, but it's fulfilling some niche probably applications. I think it will be similar for terahertz. Now, at the end of the day, the higher you go, it becomes a lot more challenging to actually propagate, beyond a certain distance, right? So I'm more of the pragmatist, again, going back to, okay, show me what applications this really can solve. Because if I were a betting man, I would really bet on midband.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Quickly, we are repeating the time. Dan, your views on
Yeah,
spectrum?
really quickly. Manisha said about 6G and spectrum being the only part which you can't really softwareize at the moment. It's also the bit which takes longest to coordinate, and we have to be able to coordinate it, which is why going into World Radio Congress 2023, the main thing that we need to do is get the right agenda items on the agenda for World Radio Congress 2027-28, so that the spectrum is available at the right time for anything which is labeled as 6G if it requires new spectrum bands. So we don't want individual regions leading. We need global alignment, and we need to have some proper coordination.
All right. So 30 seconds each of you. If we have to meet here again for in a conference like this in, say, 2025, which is not far off, as some of you mentioned, what do you think we'd be discussing? Same thing? What is 6G? What is 5G advance, or nothing, much more, or something different? Let's start with Dan, and then Manisha and Ian. 30 seconds.
I think we might be talking about an AI ML reality check. When we get to doing AI in ways which looks at the compromises that you put into networks, I think we might start to find that artificial intelligence gives us very similar answers to 30 years of network development and network engineering intelligence.
Very well. Thank you. Manisha.
I hope we are not still talking, we didn't talk about it much, but we are not still talking about the digital divide and how the next G is going to solve it. I hope that in 3 years, we'd be well along the way of bridging the digital divide using the technologies we have now. I think we can do it.
All right. Thank you. Ian?
I mean, I would put my kind of ORAN Alliance hat on, and I would say in 2 years, we'll say, look at Open RAN. I think that's the best idea we've come up with so far.
Yeah, we didn't touch upon the open and aggregated RAN and all that because that's 2 hour of discussion on its own. So I purposely didn't didn't bring that in. But thank you very much. I think this was a very interesting and enlightening experience. I mean, everybody was, I think, was expecting that, oh, 6G is going to be great, and then what are the business models and such. But I think the reality is it's good to start talking about it, but we still have a lot to deliver on what we promised with 5G as an industry. So, with that, thank you very much. And let me thank you, all of you guys, all the panelists, for an engaging and informative session. And of course, thanks to the audience who asked many interesting questions. Sorry that we could not get to all of them. Indeed, was a great pleasure moderating this panel. I hope to catch up with you all again in the next one. Thank you again. Back to Alejandro.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Prakash, and of course to our panelists for such a great discussion. To all those of you sending questions, that was really great to see and hear from so many of you. Before we close here, as always, a special thank you to our partner for this session, Viavi Solutions, and also to all of our speakers for their time. Right. Well, I hope you're going to stick around with us. We'll be back at 2 p.m. Eastern for our next session, and we're going to be talking about 5G Core, building an open multi-vendor ecosystem. We've talked about Open RAN. We've talked about everything about RAN. So let's head on over to the core and see what's happening there. Until then, we invite you to check out our partner content hub for all the wonderful content our sponsors and partners have put up there. And until then, thanks so much again for attending, and take care. We'll see you at 2 o'clock.